Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this online webinar from the IFS, where my colleagues are going to be providing you with the initial results of a remarkable survey that they've carried out over the last, just over the last few weeks, to look at how families are spending their time in lockdown. Some incredibly important questions here about what's happening to children, what's happening to their education, how they're spending their time, how that's different between those from different social groups, but not just how children are spending their time and what impact that's likely to have on their education, but also how mothers and fathers are spending their time. Now, the results of this work, the results looking at the impact on children was published last week. The results looking at impacts on mothers and fathers was published this morning. My colleagues have done this at incredible speed. We're very grateful indeed to the Nuffield Foundation for funding this work and for being very quick as well to agree to fund work, which has allowed us to carry out this survey at great speed. My colleagues will be doing more work with this survey, resurveying some of these people over the next few weeks, and then hopefully following up to look at longer term consequences. But for now, first, Monica Costa-Diaz will be telling you a little about the survey itself, and in particular, then looking at the impacts on children and how their educational time has been changing over this period and how that relates to their social background. And then Lucy Craftman will speak to the report out this morning about how mothers and fathers are spending their time. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Monica. I should say, if you do want to ask questions, just do send an email to events@ifs.org.uk. That's events@ifs.org.uk. And then after Monica and Lucy have spoken, I can put some of those questions to them. They'll speaking for hopefully a bit less than half an hour between them, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't seem to be able to show my image. Now here. Thank you, Paul. And as Paul mentioned, today, Lucy and I will tell you about our new findings from this new study of how families with children are spending their time in lockdown and the challenges that they are facing. I should mention before I start that this is joint work with a group of other researchers from the Institute for Fiscal Studies and from the Institute of Education at UCL. Now, I start by mentioning that the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown measures that were implemented to contain its spread are changing in dramatic ways how many of us are organizing our lives. In particular, families with children are being affected by the closure of schools and childcare facilities, which have meant that most childcare and education activities are now happening at home under the responsibility of parents. Moreover, many parents are now facing job losses, while others who continue to work are doing so from home. Now, these changes mean that for many families, all daily activities are happening, of all family members are now happening at home. These include work, caring for and educating children, housework, and leisure. And these activities may happen at the same moment in time of the day. Now, this can put an enormous pressure on how household resources and their time affecting family lives now and possibly carry over long-lasting consequences for children and for adults, including on education outcomes of children and on the employment and earnings of parents. In particular, there is a risk that these effects reinforce existing inequalities if those from more deprived backgrounds are less prepared to deal with the major challenges imposed by the social distance measures. In order to investigate the hurdles that families are confronting and what can be done to support them, we are working on a project with 4 main aims. First, we want to document how families are reacting to the crisis in terms of how they organize their daily routines and manage to attend to all demands on their time. We will look at how children are dealing with having to spend their entire days at home and how they are coping with their learning and educational activities. And we will also be looking at how parents are dealing with the huge increases in the demand for their time from having to homeschool and care for their children with very little help. Second, we want to measure how these effects relate to existing inequalities, both within and across families, and the ways in which they reinforce or attenuate these existing inequalities. For instance, we will be considering how different schools are providing help with homeschooling. And we are also going to be considering the extent to which mothers and fathers are sharing equally or not the additional responsibilities that they now face. And we are going to relate all these to the previous employment and earnings of post-parents. Third, we want to examine what the long-lasting implications of these immediate effects may be. And finally, we want to draw the policy implications from our findings. While we are not going to go through all of these today, because time was short in preparing all these reports, we will give you a glimpse of what our main findings so far have been. Now, to do this analysis, we collected data on almost 5,000 parents living with school-aged children in England. This was done using an online survey, which collected information between April the 29th and May the 15th of this year. As Paul mentioned, this was funded by the Nuffield Foundation. Now, just a really short technical note, we stratified and reweighted our sample very carefully to ensure that it represents the diversity of families in England along many dimensions. Now, our survey collects information on a range of dimensions of family daily life, which include, in particular, time use diaries that record on an hourly basis what the main respondent was doing in a normal weekly day. And it also records what their partner were doing and one of their school-aged children was doing in a similar format. One thing to notice is that our time use data was collected in a way that captures the extent to which parents with children are multitasking. This is important because it reveals the quality of time dedicated to each activity during the day. We also collect information on home learning activities children are pursuing and the resources available to support these, including those provided by the school, and on the employment and earnings of parents, both at the time of the survey and in February before the lockdown. In the study and the results that we are showing today, we are going to focus on opposite gender partnerships. This doesn't mean that that's the only types of families that we surveyed. It is not. We have collected information for other family types as well, but we have not worked with that data so far. So I am going to go through and discuss some of the results we have had for children and what they are doing with their time and how their education and learning activities are being supported. And then Lucy will follow to discuss how parents are dealing with the new challenges that they are facing. I start by asking how children are spending their time during the day. And here I'm going to concentrate on two main activities, learning and leisure, or activities related to learning and leisure. And on the leisure activities, I'm going to split them in two groups, depending on whether or not they are spent on screen. Now, this graph here shows the number of 1 hour slots in which parents report their child doing these activities separately for primary school-aged children and for secondary school children. Now, the graph shows that both primary and secondary school children are on average doing learning activities for roughly the same time as that taken by classes during a normal school day. It's about 4.5 hours per day in our survey. However, there are quite marked differences in how much learning time different children are doing. Some are doing very little, by which I mean 1 hour or less per day, and some more are actually doing quite a lot with more than 8 hours. But the majority of them, of more than 70% of children, report that they are doing learning activities in 2 to 7 1-hour slots per day. Now, there are important differences across groups, particularly in how leisure time is spent. Almost 50% of secondary school children spend negligible amounts of time in leisure activities offline. Now, these include some really important activities such as exercising or reading for pleasure. In contrast, they are spending quite some long hours on leisure activities on screen, which include watching TV and social media or playing online games. About a quarter of them actually select on-screen leisure in 8 or more hour slots per day. Primary school children, on the other hand, spend more time on off-screen leisure than on screen, but on-screen leisure is also very common for them. Now, what I'm now going to investigate is whether the time that children dedicate to learning activities varies with socioeconomic backgrounds. And we do this in this figure, splitting families in 5 equally sized groups by family earnings equivalized to account for the number of individuals in the family. Here, I show results for the bottom, middle, and top income groups. We see that children in the highest income group of families spend about 5.8 hours a day on education, which is 75 minutes more than children in the poorest fifths of families. Now, this difference is slightly larger for primary school children, but is still very large for secondary school children of over 1 hour. Now, what does this mean cumulatively over time? Let's take the 34 school days between the start of the school closures on March 23 and June the 1st, which is the earliest date at which some children might return to school. Now, over this period, children in the richest fifths of families might have spent an extra 44 hours of home learning, which is equivalent to over 7 full school days. If, however, children only go back to school in September, better off children will have spent 92 hours more on home learning than their worse off peers. And that is about 15 days of school. These are very meaningful differences. Previous research has found that as little as an extra hour of instructional time each week is associated with substantial increases in test scores over the course of a school year. Now, of course, it also matters what children are doing during their learning time, as not all activities are equally productive for learning. And not all of them, of course, as well rely to the same extent on parental support. Our learning activities include 4 big groups: online classes that are provided or suggested by the school, other work assigned by the school, time spent on with a paid private tutor, and time on other educational activities. So this figure here shows how learning time is split between these 4 activities for primary and secondary school children from the same 3 economic background groups. What it shows is that children in better off families are spending more time on nearly every educational activity than their less well-off peers, and that this is true for both primary and secondary school children. Now, the gaps are particularly notable for activities provided by schools, including online classes and other schoolwork. It is also clear from the figure that time in private tuition, although short on average for all, is again longer for children from better off families. Indeed, only 9% of children in the bottom income group have private tuition classes, while that number grows to 20% in the top group. Now, these differences mean that children from better off families are not only doing a higher quantity of home learning, they also have access to potentially higher quality home learning opportunities. In addition, the activities that children from better off families are doing may also require less parental support, and so are less likely to overload parents with additional demands and to depend on the ability and availability of parents to be completed. So what are schools doing to support this learning from home? Now, here we focus on secondary school children only, as the more advanced work that they are doing will likely raise especially hard challenges for parents to get to grips with. The previous graph has shown that better off students are more likely to be getting active support in learning through, for instance, online classes and private tuition. Now, looking more in depth at the resources schools are providing, we see that private schools and the state schools that children from better off families attend are providing more activities that involve active engagement between teachers and students. And these include online classes, video chats, and online chats, which are the three top groups in this graph. Now, taken together, the results I've discussed so far show that children from more disadvantaged backgrounds are doing substantially less learning activities than their better off peers, and that they also are getting less good quality support in doing so. Unless there is a concerted effort to help these children, it is almost certain that this crisis will result in widening an already prominent attainment gap between children from poorer and better off backgrounds in England. Now, given that the school system plays such a key role in equalizing the opportunities of children across socioeconomic groups, it is important to understand how reopening schools may help reversing the inequalities in learning activities that seem to have intensified over this period. We all know that government is actively seeking ways to restart schools, considering when to do it and which groups to prioritize. The success of such policy and the extent to which it may contribute to reduce the long-term consequences of the inequalities in learning that may be happening depends on whether families are willing to send their children back to school once they reopen. Now, this graph here provides a first glimpse at that by showing how parents view the possibility of sending their children to school under the current circumstances. It shows very clearly that parents are very skeptical about this possibility, and that those from less privileged backgrounds are even more so. Indeed, only about 30% of parents from the most deprived families would consider sending their children to school now if these were to reopen. Better off parents are more positive about this possibility, but even among them, only about 50% will take this opportunity. So we cannot say what reasons are behind this result because our data does not allow us to do so, but this strong relationship between income and willingness to return to school risks a situation where the children who are most able to cope with home learning are exactly those who return to school, leaving their more disadvantaged peers at home. Now, this risks widening the gaps in learning even further. I'm now going to pass on to Lucy for a discussion of the challenges parents are facing and how they are dealing with them.
Thank you, Monica. So as Monica mentioned, I'm going to be talking about how parents in opposite gender households are able to cope. So as we can imagine from what Monica's been mentioning, that additional childcare responsibilities, among other factors, are surely going to have a large impact on how parents spend their time during lockdown. So how exactly might parents be coping, and why do we care about this? The way that couples now divide their newly added load of childcare and also other household responsibilities alongside their paid work during the crisis could have very long-term effects. We could hypothesize that mothers may be more likely to take a step back from their paid work to increase their load of housework and childcare, and this could have a long-run hit on earning prospects. Both in the short run, if they're working less or not working at all, this could have an impact on their earnings and wages, but also on the long run, this time out of work could have an impact on their future earning prospects. This could potentially be detrimental to the progression that we've seen in the improvement of the gender pay gap over the last few decades. However, we could also consider that fathers will increase the amount of childcare and housework they're doing compared to what they were doing before the lockdown. Now, there is other evidence to suggest, for example, looking at paternity leave literature, that shows that if fathers pick up the amount of childcare and housework they're doing for a limited period of time, this can have long-term impacts on how much they do, increasing the amount they do in the long run. So from our data, we can see how exactly mothers and fathers in heterosexual couples are currently spending their time. So here I show a panel of 6 figures, all of which show on the y-axis the percentage doing an activity, and on the x-axis we have the time of day. So we go from midnight all the way through to the next evening. Now, if we look at the bottom row, we see leisure, personal care and sleep. And in these environments, mothers and fathers are doing almost exactly the same, and things look pretty sensible. For example, in the early hours of the morning, most mothers and fathers are asleep, and in the middle of the day, most mothers and fathers are awake. Personal care rises slightly in the morning and in the evening, and leisure seems to increase throughout the day and peak in the early evening. Now, what we're really going to focus on is paid work, housework, and childcare. As we can see, for paid work, fathers in any given hour of the day are more likely to be working. At the peak, at around noon, almost 40% of fathers are likely to be working, compared to around 20% of mothers. Now, if we look at housework and childcare, it's the opposite story. We see that mothers at any given hour are more likely to be doing housework or childcare. If we look at childcare, we can see that mothers in the middle of the day, almost 80% of them are doing some childcare. And this is compared to around 50 to 60% of fathers. Now, there's many reasons why we might imagine that mothers and fathers are doing different responsibilities in the home during lockdown. So the first thing to consider is the fact that perhaps fathers are more likely to be working and mothers less likely. And indeed, we see this. We see that mothers are more likely to have lost or furloughed their job since lockdown. Here I'm just showing the proportion of mothers and fathers who are working both outside and inside the home in the dark and light green, and those who are being furloughed or have been actually laid off or quit in the greys. And we see that mothers are actually more likely to have been laid off or quit since lockdown began, with 16% of them in this group, compared to 11% for fathers. Now, this is in addition to the fact that fathers were more likely to be working in the first place. So pre-lockdown, we were seeing that mothers were working just 80% of the time compared to fathers, and this has reduced down to 70%. They're also slightly more likely to have been furloughed. So perhaps this is suggesting if mothers are working less, that they have more time to spend on housework. But we also see within those who are working that mothers have greatly reduced their hours and are more likely to be interrupted during these hours of paid work. So here I'm showing both our results from this survey in the 2020 April data compared to other time use data collected in 2014-15 of a very similar sample. And what we can see amongst mothers and fathers who are working, firstly, a great reduction in the hours worked for both mothers and fathers. We see that mothers are doing less than 5 hours work now compared to over 6 hours in 2014-15, and fathers are doing just over 7 compared to around 8.5. Now, the dark green shows uninterrupted hours. And what we mean by this is that they do not say they're doing any other activity during this hour besides paid work. The light green is interrupted hours. So this is hours of which they say they are doing, for example, childcare or leisure or housework in the same hour as work. And what we can see is that mothers have a much larger number of interrupted hours now during the lockdown, both compared to prior to lockdown, but also compared to fathers. In fact, they're left with only just around 2.5 hours of uninterrupted work compared to over 5 for fathers. Now, despite what we've seen about work, whether women are working or not, they still seem to participate in much more housework and childcare. So to show this here, I'm comparing mothers and fathers who are not working and mothers and fathers who are working. So first, looking at the top of this figure amongst mothers and fathers who are not working. What we can see is even if fathers are not working, they are still doing less hours of housework and childcare compared to mothers who are not working. There seems to be around an hour gap in both cases. Now, comparing mothers and fathers who are working, as we've already seen, we know that fathers are doing more paid work than mothers, but mothers more than compensate with the number of hours they're doing in childcare and housework, as they're doing more than 2 hours more of childcare and around an hour more of housework. Now, what we can look at next is actually comparing within a household and looking at households where, in one case, fathers are the only ones working and the mothers are not working, and then another household where just the mothers are working. Now, in these kind of more extreme cases, we may imagine a real reallocation of responsibilities within the household. And what we see is when just the father is working, they are doing, as we've seen, around 7 hours of paid work in a day, and mothers are doing almost 11 hours of childcare, or there are 11 hours where they say they are doing some childcare, and over 4 of housework. Fathers are still doing some childcare and housework, but significantly less than the mothers. Now, if we look at households where just the mother is working, childcare and housework has picked up a lot for fathers. They're doing a lot more that, compared to fathers who are working. However, very interestingly, they're still doing around the same as mothers. And these are the mothers that are still participating in paid work. So although fathers are doing over 9 hours of childcare and almost 3 hours of housework, mothers are doing almost the same, and in addition, 5 hours of paid work. So we can see that the responsibility for these mothers in paid work is very high, as they are juggling both childcare, housework, and paid work. And although fathers have taken up some of the responsibility, they haven't taken as much as mothers in the same situation. So these are our key findings so far. As Monica presented, we've started to address some of the key questions on how lockdown is affecting children, and how I've tried to present some of the mother and fathers as well. But there's a lot more we can do, as Monica mentioned, with the data that we have. We have a lot more information in the survey. For example, we ask about gender norms and what people perceive as the right thing for different genders to be doing. And we also do some implicit bias tests. And these will help unpack drivers of the key decisions and whether individuals are allocating their time between, for example, childcare and paid work, because perhaps one person is better at it or one person prefers it, or if there's real gender norms in the way. We can also look at single parent households, which are surely having a lot of additional responsibilities during the lockdown, and also look at same-sex couples and try and compare how they are allocating their time. We are also able to link a large proportion of our households to the National Pupil Database. Now, this is the database that collects all their children's test scores, for example, their GCSEs and A-levels. And what this will help us do is we can link the survey data we have on how children are spending their time and how parents are spending their time to these test scores and see how it will impact them in the long run. And as we mentioned, we hope to follow up with as many of these households as possible to see how they've adapted over time, and also include other additional questions, for example, on their stress and well-being. So I'll leave it there and hand over to Paul for questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Monica and Lucy. We've got a couple of questions here. As I say, if you do have questions, do email them to events@ifs.org.uk. But the first question we've got is about the long-term implications of these changes in time use. So we've seen that there have been big changes. But I suppose both for children and for parents, to what extent are these things that we ought to worry about in the long run? You touched on this for children, Monica. I mean, one could say, well, this is one term out of the, I don't know how many it is, dozens of terms that children are at school through their educational career. How much should we worry about missing a few days of school over all of that time? You need to unmute yourself, Monica.
Many apologies. So as I've said, there is former research that shows that really small increments in the time in the classroom can have long-term consequences for children as outcomes. And these are very significant changes or differences in between socioeconomic groups in terms of the time they are spending in learning activities. Now, we don't really know whether these learning activities are as effective as time in the classroom, and so it's difficult to compare as we haven't had these experienced before, but if they are equivalent or similar to the time in the classroom, and the quality as well of the learning activities that children from better off backgrounds is also having an impact, then we can expect that children, when they come back to school, are going to be at very different levels in terms of their achievements in education.
Okay, so quite worrying for the long run. And Lucy, I mean, do we know anything about the extent to which these changes in parental behaviour over a relatively short period are likely to impact on their longer term behaviour in the labour market or at home?
So the closest literature we could probably look at is, for example, maternity leave, where often women take a long period, for example, 6 months to a year, out of the labour force when they have their first child. From this literature, from work from Monica and other co-authors, we see that in short term, skills can decumulate fast, and this can have long-term impacts on their earning profiles. So if we look at this literature, it does seem like it can have quite long-term scarring effects. One of the questions we might wonder is how long we'll be in lockdown and how long these things will carry on. But if we imagine that this could carry on for a while, for example, if schools aren't going back until September for some children, then we could imagine quite long-term impacts.
Great. We've got a question here specifically about the survey, about who the main respondent usually was. To what extent was it usually mothers responding? To what extent was it fathers? To what extent was it fairly evenly split? Monica?
So maybe I can go ahead. It was evenly split. So the way we draw the sample was such that we will have a fair representation of all groups and of all individuals in families with children. And therefore we ensured that both mothers and fathers were approximately evenly represented in the sample. Okay,
that's very helpful. And there's a rather speculative question here, which is, do you have any sense as to why the poorest primary school parents are less likely to be happy to send their children back to school? Did you get anything from the survey about the reasons behind these views, or are we just left with the raw views, as it were?
We can only speculate. We have no information because we also did not expect these results. We have no information about what can be driving these views that parents are expressing. It could be the case that parents from poorer backgrounds are more concerned about infection with COVID, perhaps because as well, other studies have found that they are more exposed to the virus already, and therefore they don't want to still increase their risk. But as I say, this is speculation.
And I think there's probably one for you, Lucy. Someone's asked, I mean, we've obviously gone through the sort of economic differences in educational activities, but in terms of the gender differences between mothers and fathers, are there any class differences there? Is there a bigger change for those with higher or lower incomes, or is we seeing the same across the board?
So we did look a little bit into this. So for example, we looked at the impacts or the changes since lockdown on labour market outcomes by qualifications of the parents. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, although for both mothers and fathers, you are more likely to have been laid off or quit or furloughed if you are from if you have a lower education. So for example, GCSE or below, the gaps aren't perhaps as large as you may expect. Having said that, it's more likely that those with degrees are able to work from home, and more likely that those without a degree are working outside the home. And this correlates with the type of occupations that you're perhaps able to do. We don't really see much of a difference in gender on that.
Okay. And that's interesting, Monica, when it came to looking at the differences in terms of children's educational behaviour, you split the sample by income. If you were to split by education of the parents, would you have got a similar kind of a similar kind of pattern, or is that not something you've looked at yet?
we would have got a similar kind of pattern. We didn't because there are the two education of the parents, and so it's more difficult to combine. You get more groups, but the income of the family and the education of the parents are very highly correlated, and so they split the sample across similar lines.
Okay. So we've got another question about, I suppose, the sustainability of the lockdown period. The question is, how many work hours are being lost to childcare duties at the moment? Is this sustainable if we're in lockdown for a long period? So again, I suppose it's a request to speculate about the sustainability of so many people losing so many hours as a result of childcare problems.
Yeah. Well, a school day is roughly 6 hours, and we can take from previous time use data, we can see kind of how many hours children were in school or in other childcare. We also collected data on prior childcare, and although the kind of range of response is large, we see that around 10 hours per week are with kind of grandparents or other families and relatives, and this is time then lost. But what we might imagine during lockdown is that as some measures are relaxed, some parts of childcare could return, even though kids might not be back at school. So, for example, people may be allowed to leave their children with relatives or hire some childcare, which might allow them to concentrate on paid work more, even if they're not back at school.
Yes, I think there were some ONS figures came out this morning showing that a 90% fall in childcare hours among the over 60s, which I think is translatable directly into grandparents not being able to provide any of that care at the moment, and hopefully that will change fairly quickly. There's another, I think, rather important question here about what employers can do to support care staff who are caring. It says caring has an impact on productivity in the short term, but isn't there a way of stopping it impacting career opportunities in the long term? And I think, Monica, this is where some of your previous research has rather, I suppose, depressing ramifications, in the sense that at the moment we do tend to see that there are big long-term negative consequences for women spending time caring.
Yeah, that is true, Paul. So what we found in the past is that women, even if they don't stop working, but they take reduced hours of work per day, so they work part-time, they will be damaging their earnings prospects in the future quite substantially. So essentially what we see is that once women take part-time jobs, their earnings do not stop growing. And so they don't obviously grow at the same speed as those of men who don't tend to take part-time hours. So if we are to extrapolate from these results onto now, and since we are seeing that women actually are reducing the number of hours very considerably, and not only that, but that the productivity of these hours may also be compromised by the fact that they are constantly being interrupted by other demands of their domestic responsibilities, then we may suspect that some damaging of their earnings prospects is coming through in the future. Yes.
I'm afraid it is a rather powerful result of work that Monica and colleagues have done over the last few years, that working part-time it seems incredibly bad for your future earnings. And of course, a large fraction of women, after they've had children, do work part-time for a period. So what you see is that men's and women's earnings are not terribly different until the point of childbirth, and then they just diverge further and further and further, and a large fraction of that divergence appears to be down to the amount of time that women spend in part-time work, because part-time work does not appear to provide the earnings progression that full-time work provides. So I think that's another reason to be really quite concerned, as Monica was saying, by some of these results. So there's a question here about families receiving, I suppose it's asking, shouldn't families be receiving funds from the government to support home schooling? It says, with most parents working reduced hours, not being able to afford appropriate childcare, isn't there a support scheme for families to have access to PCs, tablets, and those sorts of things? Lucy, is that, I mean, there's a little bit of that, isn't there, on the IT side, but not much when it comes to some of the more fundamental things that families might need.
Indeed. So there is a scheme, especially as you said, to, for example, to provide laptops and other technology to households. We do see a proportion of children, especially in the most deprived areas, who are relying on mobile phones, even a shared mobile phone, for example, a mobile phone of their parent, to access schoolwork. So you can imagine the difficulty there. There are other restrictions which might be harder to adapt to, for example, space. So we see in our work that more in children, especially in primary school, in the most deprived households, do not have a space to work on, either shared or their own. Now, these are harder for the government to kind of provide in the short term. And you could imagine these can have long-term effects on the quality of the work the kids are having, and also kind of wider impacts. For example, if they're having to work in a cramped area, sitting on the floor. So the difficulties might lie in something like that.
Yeah. No, those are much harder, at least in the short run, for government to do anything about. Straightforward question here, I think. How did you define housework? Lucy?
So we defined housework quite broadly as, I think, well, we gave some examples. So for example, cleaning the house, preparing meals, but we also included, for example, doing DIY and administrative tasks. But it was slightly up to the respondents to decide. I have to say that you had a number of options of things you could do, and so you had to pick one. So for example, as long as it didn't really fit into any other category, it would go into housework. And there were only, for example, childcare, housework, leisure, paid work, the ones I showed you as the activity options.
Okay, well, from a nice easy question to a really hard question, what do you propose to do with these findings? What are the implications for what we do as we come out of lockdown? Either one of you.
So first of all, we need to double down on these findings, in the sense that we need to continue following these families and these parents to understand whether these patterns are to be continued for a substantial period of time, or whether this is a relatively short period where families are facing, these struggles. It may be, or we suspect now that, as lockdown continues, they may be facing these struggles for for a substantial amount of time, and so there might be long-term consequences. Now, in terms of policies that can address, the increase in inequalities that we potentially are seeing, well, on the school side, there might be a case for schools to focus on particular groups of children and to provide extra support for them, and to develop policies in which that direct schools in how they can support children who continue learning from home. On the parental side, obviously, it's always a bit more difficult, because it depends on how the labor market is going to react. Many parents have lost their jobs, and more women than men have lost their jobs. And the women and men who have lost their jobs, the majority, or a large share of them, are lower educated, lower skilled workers. And there are no jobs now coming out, no vacancies now coming out for these types of workers. And so there there will be a role for policy to incentivize the creation of new jobs, but also potentially to train workers to fill vacancies that may appear on sectors that now are starting to come out of this recession and need workers with certain skills that these workers who have lost their jobs don't have. So this might be a way of restarting the economy in a way that may help some of the parents.
Did you have any thoughts on that, Lucy? That was a pretty good answer, but
I think that was a pretty good answer. I guess one thing that I've been thinking a bit about is in terms of the inequalities in education. We can think of the inequalities kind of in input, so how much they're learning and stuff, but also on the output side, and in terms of how much it's going to impact different children at different ages. We know that for example, some years have tests coming up which can have very long-term effects, for example GCSEs and A-levels going to university, and also, for example, some research suggests that very early years inputs have a really large impact in the long run. So these are the kind of things that policymakers might want to think about.
And presumably with you said, Monica, you're going to follow up by linking some of this with the National Pupil Database. So you'll be able to see to some extent whether this is creating a bigger gap in performance at GCSEs and A-levels than we might otherwise have expected. And if that's the case, one perhaps might hope that universities and others might take into account lower grades from those from lower social groups than in a more active way than they might otherwise have done.
Yeah, that's true, Paul. We are linking to the NPD database, which means that in 1 year time, we will have some results on how children might have been affected, and so how their test results might have been affected, and affected differently depending on children's conditions at home. And that information may provide, support for some government policies in terms of supporting these children, through A levels for the GCSEs. For instance, but also for universities to adjust their rules in terms of intake.
I mean, I found very striking in this work and the work of the Sutton Trust the huge differences between what private and state schools are doing, as well as the differences between state schools. So there's one question here. Always asking for more research. What about single parents and same-sex parents? Are you going to be presenting any results on those?
We will be looking at those. We haven't yet, so hence why we didn't present any results on them. But our sample does cover these cases, which obviously, in particular, the single parents face especially challenging circumstances if they are single-handedly leading with all the housework, childcare, and work that they have to do.
Question about private tuition. One person saying they're surprised by how much there is of it, particularly for primary school children. Do you have any sense of how much this has changed relative to normal times? Do we know whether this is the private tuition during lockdown is more than pre-lockdown, or are we only able to say that's how much it is now?
I don't know. That's the short answer. Lucy, I'm not sure whether you have.
No, we don't collect direct data comparing from pre-lockdown, but I guess as children have more time at home, there's almost more time for a tutor to be filled, for example. So we can only speculate that it's increased, but I wouldn't be certain. Okay.
So the last question at the moment, and it's quite a positive one, so maybe it's a good one to end on. Did you collect any data on positive effects of families spending more time together, family intimacy or closeness? I suppose you could have put that the other way around in terms of more rows and difficulties. But did you collect anything on how families are sort of coping in a more emotional sense?
So we haven't in this round of the survey, in particular because these are sensitive questions, and we were worried that families, may react to these questions. However, because we are doing some second and third round of the survey, we are now designing questions along these lines to try to understand whether, families are valuing their time together, or whether on the other side, actually there's been more conflict created by the fact that they have to spend their entire days together in the same very confined space.
Can you give us a sense of when the next set of reports are going to come out with these second and third waves?
So a new wave is going out in June, which means that pretty short after that we will be able to report on new findings. The next wave is going to be in beginning of 2021.
Okay, great.
From our survey also, we do ask, it's just within our survey for the children, we ask them who they're spending their time, who's in the room with them. Mm-hmm. So although we don't have kind of whether it was a positive or kind of negative experience with them, we do know if the children were spending a lot of time alone in their room compared to if they're spending time in the same room. So that's something that we could look into kind of in the shorter term.
Brilliant. Well, look, we're coming to the end of our time, and the questions I think have now come to an end as well. So thanks ever so much to everyone who's been watching, and particularly to Lucy and Monica and the extraordinary team of people they've been working with who have put these reports out at incredibly short notice. Particular thanks to the Nuffield Foundation for funding this. And watch this space, as you've just heard, the next round of the questionnaire will go out fairly soon, and no doubt another report will be turned around at speed after that. So this is a set of work which is going to continue over not just the next couple of months, but over the next couple of years as we follow these families up. So lots of very important and interesting things coming out of this, both for the research and for the policy implications. So thanks again, Lucy, Monica. Thank you everyone for watching.